Okay, Rabbi Sai, welcome to Egypt. Yeah. Baruch Hashem. We made it here. Incredible, incredible. Very, very excited to be here. Very excited to go around, to see, to experience, to talk about some of the Gavaldic things. Rabbi Sai, we're holding in one of the oldest memories that Klal Yisrael has, mamish from the Torah. We're dealing with things that we've never done before. Every year we'd like to go on trips. We've gone to Italy, we've gone to Poland, we've gone to Ukraine. But those are things that, happened in the last few hundred years. We're talking about something mamish from the Chumash, things that we grew up with, memories that the Torah writes so much and dedicates so many parashas, so many psukim to what we're about to experience and see with our very own eyes. So it's a Gavaldic Oskos to be here. But before we start, I just want to give you a little bit of a minute or two idea of exactly what happened in Egypt after Yetzias Mitzrayim. But before that, a lot of the Oinim were wondering, how are we here? The Torah says clearly that you're not, in fact the Torah says 3 times that you're not allowed to go to Mitzrayim. So what is the pshat? How? Some of the boys were asking this, some of the parents were asking this. What are we doing over here? How are we allowed halachically when the Torah clearly says not to go down to Mitzrayim? So there are a few reasons why it's asa. What is the problem with going to Mitzrayim to begin with? Reason number 1 is that the people of Egypt were at the time very immoral, and therefore because of that we don't want the Yidden to go back and be influenced negatively by the Egyptians, by the place over here. Number 1, that was number 1. Number 2, that it would be a little bit of a chutzpah, so to speak, kaviyachol to the Yeshiva after the Yeshiva took us out of Mitzrayim and we just walked back in. So that's also another reason that they bring down. The Arizal brings another reason. The Arizal brings down that Lemaisa, that wherever, a very beautiful pshat says the Arizal, wherever Yid lives, he needs to extract the holiness that's hidden in that place and elevate that holiness. That's the klal from the Arizal. But he says that when the Yidden left Mitzrayim, they emptied out all the holiness, all the kedusha that was here, that they had perhaps elevated when they were here, was emptied out. And therefore there is absolutely nothing for a person to gain of kedusha, says the Arizal. Now we know that the Yerushalmi tells us, the Talmud Yerushalmi tells us in Masechta Sukkah that there are many times that the Yidden ignored this prohibition of going back to Egypt, and the consequences were very, very tragic. I'm not going to go through them now, but what I will tell you that even though there were tremendous tragedies here, even well after Yetzias Mitzrayim, there are many Choshev Yidden, Gedolim and tzaddikim that actually lived in Egypt, didn't just go back, but actually lived here. Just to give you some of them perhaps you know. One famously was obviously the Rambam. He lived here for many years. The Radvaz, Rav David ben Zimra, the Radvaz, lived here until 1589. Rabbi Tzalal Ashkenazi, famously known as the Shita Mukabetzes. The Shita Mukabetzes was the Rebbe of the Arizal. He also lived in Mitzrayim, and of course we know that the Arizal himself also lived here as well, which is unbelievable. We might even be zeicher to go to 1 or 2 of the kivrei of some of the tzaddikim. Well, I didn't mention, but maybe that we'll get to when we get there. Just to mention some ideas. So we said it's asa to come here, but yet people have done it. What's pshat? Why do people come here? Why are we here? Of course, apart from seeing what the Rabbeinu Shalom gave us and what happened, but one of the things is the Aram says pshat that going back to Mitzrayim is only if you go from Eretz Yisroel. And therefore, if you don't come from Eretz Yisroel, there are many people that come straight from other countries. We did come from Eretz Yisroel, but there are those people that don't. So therefore, that's very good. It came from a lot. Now another pshat is that it's only also to go in the same route that Klal Yisrael left in. If you take a different route, then it is okay, which obviously we are taking. We'll talk about more of that when we get to Har Sinai. The other thing is that since the Egyptians at the time were very immoral, that doesn't really apply that much nowadays more than any other place, and therefore it doesn't apply. It's also another thing as well that most of the actual native Egyptians were already exiled, they're not here anymore, and therefore the Issa no longer applies. And someone would say it doesn't apply after Churban Beis HaMikdash, and the Radvaz famously says only if you only actually move here with the intention of living. If you're simply coming here just to tour, which actually the Rambam brings down, that if you're just going along to tour, it's not a problem. In fact, the Rambam brings down that he's talking about his letter. Now, the Rambam wrote many letters here in Egypt when he lived here. Maybe we'll talk about that more when we get to the Genizah in Cairo. But the Rambam signs off, interestingly enough, many of his letters. He writes himself that I am the one that is over on 3 Isurim every single day that I'm here. That's what he writes about himself at the end of his letters, because he lived in Mitzrayim. But the many want to say pshat, he was just doing it out of anivus. He wasn't doing it because he actually held that it was actually asa. Now, apart from the Chumash telling us about what happened in Mitzrayim, Lemaisa, it's very interesting. I tried to check up and I did a little bit of research. There is almost no historical or archaeological evidence of any story of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish nation, being in Mitzrayim that took place. There is basically no evidence that we can find. There are a few pictures, there are a few things that maybe we'll talk about, but there's no real evidence. What we do have, about 600 or 700 years after it happens, so the Egyptians were actually very upset with the Jewish people, because they claim that the story never happened, right? And in the 3rd century, there was a big Egyptian priest by the name of Netho. So he wrote a very, very famous writing in Greek with much of the history of what happened in Egypt and everything that happened. And he said that what the Jews claim that happened in Egypt with the Egyptians, with the slavery, it's not true. We have the real story. And he claims to have various records about what actually happened. Now, we obviously understand why he was upset about our story, because our story basically makes it out that we were, persecuted and we were in slavery and the Egyptians were terrible, terrible people. So obviously he didn't like it. Now, their version of the story was slightly different. Their version was Paro had to get closer to the gods, and therefore he had to rid Mitzrayim of the lepers and those that are impure, and many of the Jews were impure, and therefore he just had to do that in order to get closer to the gods. He wasn't doing it because he was anything against the Jews. Now, whatever it is, even though that might have been their version, I don't believe any person over here has ever heard their version, and in fact nobody's heard their version, and we even know this because every president of the United States of America makes a Leil HaSeder, a Seder night, to represent what happened to the Jews in Egypt. As far as I know, the president doesn't shake the lulav on Sukkot, and he doesn't do anything else that's representing, but they know about our story because our story made it all the way through history. Interesting, Rabbi said one last thing. In 2003, there was an Egyptian, not so long ago, 2003, there was an Egyptian that wanted to file a lawsuit. Listen to this is ridiculous. He wanted to file a lawsuit against the Jews around the world for stealing the gold and silver when they left Egypt, right, all those years ago. So he wanted to file a lawsuit again, and he called it the greatest fraud of all time. Alan Dershowitz heard about this claim, and he said, bring it on. I'm ready to represent the Jews in this case, no problem. In the end, why didn't it make it to the courts? Because the Egyptian government told him not to pursue and not to be able to press claims. You know why? Even though they claimed that it was going to go and generate trillions and trillions of dollars for the Egyptian government, but they said because if you do that, it means that you're going with their version and not our version. And we know that our version is absolutely true. And let me just end, Rabbi, say, with one last gewaldige idea. In 1896, there was a British archaeologist, Petrie, who was in Egypt, and he was doing various excavations, and he uncovered an enormous stone, which was basically, they said it was created by the son of Ramses II to recount some of the victories that he had here in Egypt. Now, when he first saw it, he said, okay, it looked like everything else I've seen, nothing big Kiddush. But at the end of the stone, as he read to the end, he was about to give up. He finished reading the text, and he realized that what he found was probably the greatest find of his entire career. During the end of the stone, it describes some of the cities in Israel that this Paro destroyed, and it includes cities like Ashkelon as well. And a phrase in this stone appears: Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. Petrie realized that what he discovered was probably the oldest mention of Israel outside the Torah, older than anything else. And it described the people arriving and leaving, being captured. He found something which did lead to the fact there was something. It was the oldest mention of Israel outside the Torah, and it's an obituary. If you think about it, it's basically Israel is finished. There's no more Klal Yisrael. It's over. Israel is gone. Their seed is not. There's no continuation of them whatsoever. However, if you think about it, and this is something to bear in mind during this trip, that every other nation that tried to get us, starting from Mitzrayim, going all the way down, is no longer here, right, in their full glory, but Klal Yisrael is. For example, if you go to the British Museum in London, the Argentine Ring talks about the destruction of Israel, that it's no more. In the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, you find all sort of gates of Nebuchadnezzar, that they have the first Beis Hamikdash, they have pictures of it saying it's all over, it's finished. In Rome, we were there, the Arch of Titus as well, the celebration, the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. If you go to museum after museum, city after city, they will talk about the Jews as being finished. It's over. But yet, Klal Yisrael are here. We are here in full strength with our Torah, with our Yiddishkeit, and we're here to celebrate that. We're here to see. Enjoy the rest of the trip. What greater place can we discuss than standing on top of what is supposed to be in what's historically known as Har Sinai, which has been checked by many people, that this is the mokom that the Torah was given to Klal Yisrael. It's been handed down throughout the generations that this was known to be the Mount of Moses. This was the mountain that Moshe Rabbeinu brought down the Torah to Klal Yisrael. What an unbelievable opportunity, Rabbi say, even though there's no be'etzem intrinsic kedusha of this mountain, but from the very fact that this was very possibly the mountain that Moshe Rabbeinu brought the Torah to Klal Yisrael, means that we know that every single situation and every single thing that happened to Klal Yisrael, there was a certain eis las, there was a certain siyata d'shmaya. So therefore, it gives us a certain siyata d'shmaya as well. And that means that in this place, we can perhaps close our eyes just for a moment and be makabel on ourselves the Torah, to be makabel on ourselves, to learn the Torah, to keep the Torah, to love the Torah, to attach ourselves to the Torah, and everything that goes together with that. It's a gewaldige schus to be here. We've climbed the mountain in Mitaka. We climbed up this mountain. We have no idea how Moshe Rabbeinu got up here, but we managed to climb up this mountain. We daven shachas over here. It was beautiful. Nates with the sunrise. It was gewaldig with the camels. But Al Kaponim Rabbi said, just think for a moment, whether it's now or as you're walking down, this was, if possible, the mountain that the Rebbeinu Shalom came down to Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael waited at the bottom, right? Mamash, there was lightning, there was thunder, the whole place was shaking, the neshamas, the Keser Shel Torah. We know the Rambam says in the beginning of Hilchas Talmud Torah, Perek Aleph, the Rambam says there are 3 ksorim. There are 3 crowns. There's the Keser of Malchus, the Keser of Kahuna, and the Keser of Torah. We know that the Keser of Malchus, okay, the Malachim and Klal, David HaMelech. The Keser of Kahuna, Aaron HaKohen. Okay, we have no choice of that. If we weren't born into a Malchus, we weren't born into a Kohen, there's nothing we could do. Oh, but the Keser Shel Torah, Zuk the Rambam, Kol Mi Sheroitze Yavo V'Yitol. Anybody that wants to chap it can chap it. If you want it, you can get it. It's sitting there waiting for you. Rabbi Isai, we're on what's supposed to be the Har Sinai. It's a schus to be here. Many people are not zoicha to be here. Be makabel on yourselves the Torah. Be makabel yourself the mitzvahs, the avas Torah, and everything that goes together with the Torah. We should be zoicha that the Be'ez Hashem, the Rabban Shem, should give us the avas Torah, the geschmack in Torah, and to be able to makayim all of the Torah. Okay, Rabbi, so we're standing by the River Nile, that we have learned so much about. Sefer Shemos, Paro famously lying in this Nile, pretending to be a god. So I just want to give you a little bit of a description before we take a boat on the Nile itself and see some of the sights. This Nile River stretches 4,184 miles. It's assumed to be the longest river in the world. Some hold that the Amazon is longer, but generally this is supposed to be the longest river in the world. It stretches as long as the distance between Warsaw and New York. That's how long of a distance it is. It begins in the western desert of Egypt in the west. As we know, there's no rain, absolutely nothing, and nobody ever wants to live there. Even the lizards that generally can cope with living in a desert can't cope with the heavy, hot humidity over there. It's the scorching midday sun. They just can't cope over there. Now, Egypt, without the Nile, is so dry, has no ability to produce anything. Nobody can live in such a place. So it's no wonder that the Nile became what we know from Chumash. It became to be the Egyptian god, right? Because it was basically their only way for them to survive. It allowed them to plant, to eat, and even to set up places of living, right? It's an interesting thing. Rashi brings down, they bowed down to the Nile because they understood that without the Nile, they would just have nothing. They wouldn't be able to live, they wouldn't be able to survive. Now, it's a very interesting thing that the River Nile flooded every August. So every August, the River Nile completely flooded, and it flooded the whole desert that was around it. The nutrients that were in the Nile spread all over the desert, and there's certain types of formed very types of landscapes, and it sort of allowed people to plant things in those places, and it nurtured the ground that was around for planting. It attracted fish, the ability to plant. This was basically their savior. Now, every single year the Nile flowed in August. The Egyptians, I don't know if they have it now, we'll have to check this up, but they had, up until not long ago, a holiday, a festival basically, for 2 weeks called Wafa Nalil. Wafa Nalil was the celebration of the ancient flooding of the Nile, which basically saved the civilization. And there's actually a blessing that many of the Egyptians, we should really check this up, there's a blessing that many of the Egyptians say around this area: may you always drink from the Nile. There's a tremendous blessing that they hold that the Nile gives them. Nowadays it no longer overflows. Right? We don't have an August overflow of the Nile anymore, simply because, not because it stopped to overflow, but because of human intervention. In 1970, they built a dam that allowed them to basically control the water, generate electricity, and the water fed and provided drinking water. Because of this, it no longer overflowed. More than 95% of the Egyptians rely on the Nile for its water, both for its field, planting, and actual drinking. And most of them also like to live within a few miles from the Nile itself. It travels through 11 countries. Now we have to remember, however spectacular the Nile is, that Klal Yisrael have experienced years and years ago tremendous tragedy in the Nile. The Nile was a Nile of blood. It was a Nile that was used for Paro to cover up his terrible, tragic Pesach, his decree on Klal Yisrael to throw all of the males in the Nile. And it was a way of covering up the way that he sort of led everything was. He didn't want to show everyone that he was a killer, that he was a murderer, but the way to do it was, no, don't murder anyone in an outright way because they're going to have evidence. So throw them in the Nile. And this way, when people would come and say, hey, what's going on? He would say, oh, really? So bring evidence and we'll sort it out. In other words, he was very open to try and sort things out, but the way of killing the Jewish children was in the Nile. So the Nile that we're going to be traveling along, although, yes, brought Egypt and Mitzrayim a lot of its nutrients and its ability to live, however, we do have to remember it is unfortunately soaked with Jewish blood. So we should remember that. And it should be, all the neshamas that unfortunately were not zocher to live more than just a few days or a few hours after being born should be zocher to have an aliyah, and you should be kaddish the mokim that we are as well. So we're standing outside the Ben Ezra Shul. The Ben Ezra Shul was known to be the shul that the Rambam himself davened in. Ovadia Yosef, which maybe we'll speak about a little bit later, who lived in Cairo for a number of years, also davened over here, gave speeches over here as well. Maybe we'll speak about those speeches a different time. One of the very famous things about this shul, which we're not able to go in now because it's under renovations, is that they found the old Genizah, which means that they found in the Ezras Noshim, they found an area that you had to go up a ladder. I will send a picture in a moment of that. They found an area in the Ezras Noshim that you would go up, and they found old manuscripts. That was basically the Genizah. The Genizah was the place that you put all the old shemus, and you put things over there that have got kedusha that you need to be buried eventually. And they found over 300,000 manuscripts, including the Rambam's own writing. They found pages from the Rambam's own handwriting in that place. It was just like, it was Hefker at one point. It got taken away by many museums. In fact, As far as I'm told, you can go onto Google and they have so many manuscripts, they don't even know what to do with it. So they're offering freelancing for anybody to decipher what it says, exactly how it says it, and they will pay a little bit of money in order to try and restore things. That's what they're trying to do. But they found 300,000 manuscripts from some of our big Rishonim who lived over here, who wrote many sedarim over here. So this was the shul that the Rambam himself done. And then obviously we can't go inside. We'd like to go inside, but we can't because of the renovations that went on. But upon him, that is the famous Ben Ezra shul over here in Cairo. While we're here, I want to mention just something else that we're not zoicha this trip to go to, mainly because it's closed, and that is the cave of Rabbi Yaakov Abuchatzira, famous Kabbalist. And he's buried far from here. It's not kedai to go. It's a long drive, and also it's actually closed. I just want to tell you a little bit about him because we are quite close. I guess closer than most people have ever been. Rabbi Yaakov Abuchatzira lived 1806 to 1880. He was known as the Abir Yaakov. He was a Moroccan gadol, and he took after his father Rav Masad. And he was known for Rabbi Yaakov Abuchatzira was known for his miracles, and he was zocheh to see Eliyahu Novi many, many times. Now his fame spread amongst even the non-Jews, that even in the Muslim world, they have a name for him. In the Muslim world, they called him the Al-Khazan El-Kabeh. That means the great rabbi. He wrote many chidushim, Nigla and Nista, all over the Torah. They never published any of his works during his lifetime. When he left the world, after he left the world, he was nifta. He came to his son in a dream and he said, okay, now you have the right to publish my works. He was desperate to go to Eretz Yisroel. His community would not allow him to leave. They only let him when he promised that his son would take over. In 1879, he was 73 years old at the time, he left Morocco. He wanted to go to Eretz Yisroel for Morocco. He went via Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and then Egypt. In Egypt, he stayed in the home of Rav Moshe Sharashi, and on Friday night during Kiddush, the candles went out. And when the candles went out, Rabbi Yaakov Abuchatzira said it was a sign that his life was about to end. 15th of Teves, he arrived in Alexandria, and he wanted to rest up a little bit before he continued his journey. 4 days later, he died. One of the most famous descendants that he has, obviously we know, is his grandson, the Baba Sali. And many years ago, not that many years ago, until a few years ago, it used to be a huge, hundreds and hundreds of people would come to his cave for the Hilula, for his yurt site, which doesn't happen so much now because of the general security situation. But upon him, we are zeicha to be in a close area to where he's buried, and a few bits up the road a little bit, but we're not going to go there, but it is something that we realize that we are here. Okay. Discuss a little bit about Cairo. We're here in Cairo, so how can we be in Cairo without actually discussing a little bit of what this is all about? Yidden lived here, they didn't live here, and I want to mention a couple of stories about Chacham Ovadia Yosef that lived here and did so much for the community before moving back to Eretz Yisroel. So first of all, Yidden came to Egypt already at the time we know of the first Beis Hamikdash, and in the around the 1st century AD, about 1 million Jews actually lived in Egypt. By 642, Egypt was occupied already by the Muslims, and Jews already became inferior citizens and were actually obligated to wear special clothing to sort of show everyone that they were actually Jewish, but they basically continued their regular jobs. Some of the Yidden actually had jobs in the government at that time. Now, throughout the 8th and 9th century, many of the Yidden of Egypt maintained very close contact with the Yeshivas of Bovel, as we know, and much of the Jewish culture here actually was based on the Talmud Bavli, and it was influenced by Arab Muslim culture as well. About 25,000 Jews lived in Egypt by the 12th century. Most of them lived in Fustat, which is where we are right now, which is Cairo, and their main language was Arabic. We mentioned before that Rav Moshe ben Maimon, the Rambam, came down to Egypt, came to Mitzrayim at about 1165 and became one of the greatest leaders of the Jewish community around the world as well. Now, just to mention a couple of ideas that about Rav Ovadia, because many of us remember, I don't know if you remember, but I remember Rav Ovadia davening by his shul, a yid that was called down to Mitzrayim. So how did he end up in Egypt? How did he end up in Egypt? How did Chacham Ovadia end up over here? So in 1947, there was a Rav called Reb Aaron Shweki, who arrived in Eretz Yisroel with one goal. And his goal was to find a Rav who could be the deputy chief rabbi of Egypt and take care and rebuild the entire crumbling system of the Beis Din at the time that was led by a Choshev Yidden, but it was all crumbling down and they couldn't cope over there. So he turned to the Rishon LeZion, Rav Ben Sion Uziel, who to ask him who would be the correct candidate to become the deputy chief rabbi of Egypt in order to build up the Jewish community, the shechita, the Beis Din, and everything that went on over here. So he consulted with the Rosh Yeshivah of Parat Yosef, Chacham Azri Atiyah, who, without any question whatsoever, said, I've got the perfect man for the job, and that is my Talmud, Rav Ovadia Yosef, who wasn't an old person, he was a young man at the time, but his incredible encyclopedia knowledge of Kol HaTorah Kuloi, his practicality, his leadership skills led him to that incredible position. Now you have to understand that there were many Yidden who lived over here. In fact, in the 1800s, there were approximately 600,000 Jews living in Egypt at the time. Their commitment to Torah was already going downhill completely. By the year 1919, there were approximately 60,000 Yidden. Most of them were not so religious. So Rav Ovadia came into Egypt with a very difficult task of trying to rebuild everything over here, which was very difficult for him. He was under threat pretty much from the very first day he arrived here in Cairo, where we are in Cairo. So he didn't have this fancy hotel and everything where he stayed, but he was under constant threat the whole time. He was under surveillance from the Egyptian government, who suspected him of being a spy for the Zionists in Israel, which were soon going to declare independence and establish a state. They followed him wherever he went. They got him into questions. In fact, one night, in the middle of the night, a group of policemen smashed into his home and started searching for weapons. They were sure he had weapons. And when he woke up and came and said, what's going on over here? They said, where are your weapons? Where are your weapons? So Rav Ovadia Kedarkai pointed to his sedarim and he said, oh, those are my only weapons that I have over here. He was constantly under attack in any way, shape or form. In fact, one time on Cholamoid Sukkot, 1948, a year after Rav Ovadia arrived over here in Cairo, a few months after the War of Independence happened, he was in the sukkah. And he was in the sukkah that he lived in a building where he put the sukkah on the roof of that building, and he was actually shaking his daled minim on the roof of that building. A policeman smashed through the door and said, you're under arrest. Right? Now, it was obvious to the policeman that the sukkah was a target for the Israeli fighter planes, and Rav Ovadia was shaking this stick in order to show the fighter planes where he was at the time. Now obviously that wasn't the case, and it took a lot of effort for Rav Ovadia to convince the judge when he was pulled away that the sukkah and the lulav were actually religious items that he was doing over there. Now, there's no question whatsoever that Rav Ovadia managed to last over here with an incredible amount of siyata dishmaya, and he had battle after battle. In fact, when he first came to Cairo, he noticed that the shuls, it doesn't say which shuls. I don't know if it was a shul that we personally visited today, or it was another shul, that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, he was shocked. Rav Ovadia found that these shuls actually got together and they would use microphones in the shuls in order to allow the entire audience to be able to hear the tefillah. And he wrote shuvas about this in Yabiya Oima, how it's awesome, whatever it was. But those are the type of battles that he was battling against. And he was very much, in fact, one incredible Maisa. This actually shows the gadlus of Rav Ovadia, but it happened over here in Cairo, that when they eventually tried to get rid of him because of lots of things with the shechita and everything else that happened, which is the whole story on its own, they appointed a replacement for Rav Ovadia without even telling him. So in all the years that he was here, the main Shabbos HaGadol drasha was in shul, and Rav Ovadia was one obviously to give the speech, and large crowds in Cairo used to come to hear Rav Ovadia to be able to give the drasha, and he was scheduled to give the drasha on Shabbos HaGadol And they didn't want to tell him that he was actually replaced by somebody else, which actually was Rav Ovadia's Talmud, who was completely not qualified to take the position, but out of, I guess it was Gaiva, decided, yes, we're going to take the position. So Rav Ovadia comes into the shul to deliver his speech, but shocked to find that his own Talmud, who had been given the position as what he was appointed to speak in that case over there, without him even knowing. One of the things that what he did was he met with President Mubarak, and he asked him to please not make a highway over one of the kvarim that maybe we'll speak in a second about, and he begged him to do that. So Mr. Mubarak, who was the president at the time, said, I don't understand, Israel does this the whole time. Israel always knocks down kvarim and puts highways. So I guess he knew some of the history over there, but Rav Ovadia managed to convince him to change the route of the highway, and successfully he was able to do that. So that was Rav Ovadia's time in Cairo, which was an incredible time that he had. Let me just mention one other idea as well, and this is a keva that we unfortunately weren't able to get to because of the security situation. We were not able to get to this keva, but this is a keva of Rab Chaim Kufasi. Rab Chaim Kufasi was known as Rab Chaim Balanes, a keva that we very much would like to have gone to, but because of the situation, the police would not allow us to be able to go anywhere near it. But let me just tell you one small thing. He went blind at one time in his life. And when he went blind, many people said it happened because he took bribes. He was a dayan, he was a rav, so shaychad, we know the Pesach tells us, it blinds people, it blinds the dayanim. And he was a dayan, so he obviously took bribes, and he was very upset by that. He gathered everyone together in the community, and he stood up in shul in front of everyone. He said, I want to promise I'm making a shavua. Never in my life did I ever take a bribe, and the Rabbeinu Yerushalayim knows this, and just to prove it, I'm going to ask Hashem to give me my eyesight back. Within a few moments, he started calling people from the crowd in order to go and say, oh, you mister, you this. He immediately recognized people, and he was blind before that, to show that he got his eyesight back. The Chidah writes about him that he saw his signature of Reb Chaim before he went blind and after he went blind. And before he went blind, it was crooked, and after he went blind, it was very, very straight, as a raya to show that he actually got his eyesight back. And the Chidah added the name Balanes, and his name was Reb Chaim Balanes. And after this in Cairo, people, anytime they wanted to make a shavua here in Cairo, they went over to his cave to do it, because they knew that if you lied at the time, you got punished. There was a certain punishment you used to get. So it was a tremendous tzaddik. He's buried here in Cairo in the cemetery by the mosque that we actually were by earlier today. And unfortunately, we weren't able to go to his cave, but his schos should be a schos on us and all of Klal Yisrael. Okay, so contrary to popular belief, the Jews did not build the pyramids. In fact, this was probably the world's first skyscraper. So the pyramids generally represent a tomb of the king that they would bury over here. And in fact, when he became king, that's when they started to build the pyramids. And it was a way of dealing with it, that they would bury the mummy inside, and it would go against the sun and the rays and everything over there. It's very interesting because it climbs at an angle of slightly less than 52 degrees and raises to a height of 480 feet, made of up of 2.6 million blocks. This is known to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. How did they, and this is why it's one of the 7 wonders of the world, is how did they do this? We're talking about 2.5 ton bricks that they managed to maneuver and build and put one on top of the other without any machinery, without any cranes. It's almost a mystery until even today in modern archaeologists. The first question that we have is, first of all, how did they get to the top? And that's actually, there are a couple of different theories. Theory number one is they built a ramp from the floor, slowly, all the way up to the top. As they got higher, the ramp obviously got higher as well. Another theory they have is they built a zigzag that was going around and around the ramp. There's no evidence to either of them. Nobody really knows exactly how they did it. Even cutting the bricks is something which is a little bit of a dispute between various people, whether it was cut with animals or whether it was cut with by placing wood in the holes and then water over there and then it bursting. The other thing was, if you look closely, which hopefully we will, to see the point of contact between the two bricks, it's amazing that they were able to get the perfection of the bricks being cut at exactly the right place, which is amazing. The internal part of the bricks, they weren't so makpid on because nobody saw that, but the outside generally was. It was so flat, it was so cut with precision, which makes it so interesting. Originally, it was coated with the white lime, which you could possibly see on the top of that one over there, the white limestone, which eventually faded away. But again, as I said, it's not built by the Jews, but one thing it possibly can represent is Klal Yisrael were here 3,334 years ago. Klal Yisrael were basically in this land over here. And although we didn't build the pyramids, we did a lot of labor, we did a lot of work with bricks, a lot of work building things, and unfortunately we know Chazal tell us that it got sunk into the ground and we have no memory of that anymore. But we know that we were here, and we know the work that we had to do, that our ancestors have. The Chinuch famously writes that in the beginning, in the Hakdama, that the foundation of every Yid started right over here. The foundation of a Yid started by Yetzias Mitzrayim, knowing that we came out of Yetzias Mitzrayim and went all the way to Har Sinai and were makabel the Torah over there. So much of our history, much of our emunah begins over here. We'll continue. Here we are by Yam Suf. It's difficult to know exactly where Klal Yisrael crossed over the Yam Suf. That's hard for us to know exactly where that happened, but it definitely happened around these shores over here behind me. Is possibly the makom where Klal Yisrael crossed. Whether they crossed and came back around or they crossed over completely, that's obviously subject to a bit of a shaila. If you could see a little bit over here, Klal Yisrael entered, and according to many, they turned around and came back on the very same shore that they went in, and then they made themselves over all the way to Har Sinai, where we basically stood ourselves, and then all the way around, obviously 40 years, led up all the way back to Eretz Yisroel. It's an amazing thing to stand in a place which, maybe not in this exact spot, but somewhere near here, Klal Yisrael stood, and Klal Yisrael had emunah in the Rabbeinu Shalom, v'amina b'Hashem of a Moshe Avdai. They believed in the Rabbeinu Shalom. They had the Mitzrim on one side. They had the mountains, which we can see over here as well. The Midbar, they were stuck. They didn't know what to do. And yet, with a leap of faith, they jumped into the Yam, and they had faith in the Rabbeinu Shalom. And that was an incredible schos, one of the greatest acts that Klal Yisrael ever did. And we should remember that act of Mesiras Nefesh in our own lives, that sometimes we face the waves, we face the shores, and we have to remember that sometimes you just need to jump in, you just need to believe in the Rabbeinu Shalom, and when you have that belief, you have everything.
Bye, 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 bye.